She was betrayed, humiliated, and thrown out on the street by her own family. But a mobster found her, and the revenge was. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. But a mobster found her, and the revenge was. The rain fell like furious tears on Victoria's shoulders, soaking the simple dress that now clung to her cold skin. Her fingers trembled when they reached the wrought iron gates, imposing like silent sentinels, guarding a world she never imagined she would need to reach. The golden lights of the mansion shone through the night mist, promising warmth that her body desperately craved, but her pride rejected. She knew that knocking on that gate meant admitting her total defeat, accepting that she had nothing left, that the family who cast her out had won. "I have no choice," she whispered to herself, tasting the bitter flavor of humiliation. The security guards appeared like silent shadows, and Victoria raised her chin even as her body trembled from cold and despair. Her words came out firmly despite the vulnerability consuming her, explaining that she needed to speak with the property owner, that she had nowhere to go, that the rain had surprised her. The men exchanged glances, evaluating whether this wet and proud woman represented any threat or just another soul lost in the storm. One of them made a discreet gesture, and the gates opened slowly, as if fate had finally decided to intervene in her favor. "Come with us, miss. He will decide what to do." The interior of the mansion was a universe of elegance Victoria had never experienced, with marble floors reflecting the light of crystalline chandeliers and Persian rugs that seemed to be worth more than everything she had ever owned. Each step she took left wet footprints on the impeccable floor, and she felt like a dirty intruder staining the perfection around her. The guards led her through corridors decorated with ancient paintings and furniture that seemed to have their own stories to tell. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the echo of their footsteps and the sound of her irregular breathing. "What am I doing here?" she thought, but it was too late to turn back. The office door opened, revealing an environment that breathed power and sophistication, with bookshelves rising to the ceiling and a fireplace that crackled softly, spreading dancing shadows across the walls. Behind a solid mahogany desk, a man raised his eyes from the documents he was analyzing, and Victoria felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Alexander Kane had the magnetic presence of someone accustomed to command, with perfectly combed dark hair and a suit that seemed to have been specifically molded for his athletic body. His eyes were the color of strong coffee, deep and penetrating, capable of reading secrets that even she didn't know she kept. "Mr. Kane, we found this young woman at the gates," announced one of the guards, but Alexander didn't take his gaze off Victoria for even a second. The silence that settled between them was charged with an electrical tension that Victoria couldn't comprehend, as if two opposing forces recognized each other and fought to maintain distance. Alexander observed her with the intensity of a predator studying its prey, but there was something more in his eyes, a curiosity he couldn't completely disguise. She could feel the weight of that gaze traveling over every detail of her wet face, from the strands of hair stuck to her cheeks to her lips that trembled more from nervousness than cold. For long seconds, neither of them moved, trapped in a silent dance of mutual assessment that seemed to last an eternity. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his deep voice echoing through the office like a distant thunder. Victoria swallowed hard, struggling to find words that would explain her situation without sounding completely desperate, although she knew that was exactly what she was. Her hands closed into fists at her sides, trying to control the trembling that dominated her, while searching for strength to maintain what dignity she had left. She told him about the debts, about the family that rejected her, about having nowhere to go, each word coming out like a painful confession that exposed her total vulnerability. Alexander listened in absolute silence, his face an impassive mask that revealed no emotion, but Victoria could feel that something had changed in the air around them. "I am not a beggar," she declared with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I just need a place to spend the night, and I can work to pay for it." Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, fingers interlaced on the desk, studying Victoria with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see through her soul. There was something in his posture that emanated absolute power, but also a deep loneliness that he hid behind a facade of total control. He could have any woman he desired. That was obvious from the luxury that surrounded him, and the aura of authority he carried. But there was something about that wet and proud girl that awakened an interest he hadn't felt for anyone in years. His eyes lingered on Victoria's trembling lips, on the delicate curve of her neck, on the way she kept her chin up even though she was clearly desperate. "And what do you know how to do?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of challenge that made Victoria's heart race. Victoria felt a wave of determination grow inside her, fueled by the need to prove she wasn't just a victim of circumstances, but a woman capable of fighting for her own survival. She spoke about her education, about the job she had done, about her organizational skills and her willingness to learn anything necessary. Her words flowed with a passion that surprised even herself, revealing an inner strength that had been tested but not broken by the betrayals she had suffered. Alexander observed every movement of her lips, every gesture of her wet hands, as if memorizing every detail of that moment. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, creating an intimate atmosphere that contrasted with the formal tension dominating the encounter. "Interesting," he murmured, and Victoria didn't know if that was good or bad. Minutes seemed to drag like hours, while Alexander remained silent, evaluating not just Victoria's words but something much deeper that he couldn't name. There was a strength in her that intrigued him, a mixture of vulnerability and pride that awakened something primitive in his chest, something he thought he had buried long ago. He could simply dismiss her, give her enough money for a hotel and forget she existed, but something prevented him from making that obvious decision. The way she confronted him, even while at a total disadvantage, the way her eyes sparkled with determination, despite the tears she refused to shed, all of this stirred something he preferred not to analyze. "You can stay," he finally said, his neutral voice betraying none of the turbulent thoughts dominating his mind. Victoria felt a confused mixture of relief and apprehension upon hearing those words, as if she had won a battle, but discovered that the war had only just begun. She knew that accepting this mysterious man's hospitality meant entering a world she didn't know, with rules she didn't understand, but the alternative was returning to the cold street and facing a night that could be her last. There was something in Alexander's eyes that made her feel both safe and threatened at the same time, as if he were capable of both protecting and destroying her with equal ease. Her instincts screamed that there was more to this man than he revealed, secrets hidden behind that mask of perfect control. "Thank you," she whispered, and the word came out loaded with a gratitude that went far beyond the shelter offered. Alexander made an almost imperceptible gesture to the security guards, who immediately moved to escort Victoria, but his eyes remained fixed on her, as if he simply couldn't let her leave his field of vision. There was something magnetic about that woman that deeply disturbed him, an attraction that went beyond the physical and touched parts of his soul that he kept carefully locked away. She wasn't like the other women who had passed through his life, always interested in his power or money, always willing to do anything to remain in his golden world. Victoria was different, genuine in her vulnerability, proud in her humility, and that frightened him as much as it attracted him. "The security guard will take you to a room and provide dry clothes," he ordered, his voice maintaining the same professional neutrality as always. When Victoria turned to follow the security guard, Alexander felt a strange pang in his chest, as if something important was slipping through his fingers before he could even understand what it was. She walked to the door with the dignity of a queen, even in her wet dress and disheveled hair, and he couldn't take his eyes off the natural grace of her movements. For a moment, she paused at the threshold and looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his in a silent connection that sent an electric current down his spine. There was no servile gratitude in her gaze, nor submission, just a cautious curiosity that mirrored his own. "Good night, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice soft as velvet, before disappearing down the corridor. The door closed with a soft click, but the silence that followed seemed deafening to Alexander's ears, as if all the energy of the office had been sucked out along with Victoria's presence. He remained seated for long minutes, staring at the door through which she had left, trying to understand what had happened in those few minutes that the meeting had lasted. His life was built on absolute control, each decision calculated, each movement planned, but something about that woman had introduced an unexpected variable into his perfect equation. He could still smell her soft perfume lingering in the air, mixed with the scent of rain she had brought with her, creating a combination that disturbed him in ways he couldn't explain. What the hell just happened? He muttered to himself, but there was no answer to the question echoing in his mind. The fire in the fireplace continued to crackle softly, casting dancing shadows across the ornate walls of the office. But Alexander couldn't concentrate on the documents he had set aside when Victoria entered. His thoughts revolved around that mysterious woman who had appeared at his door like a wet ghost, bringing with her a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. There was something in her eyes that hypnotized him, a depth that suggested painful experiences and a strength that hadn't been broken by them. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, watching the rain still falling on the gardens, wondering if he had made the right decision in letting her stay. This woman is going to be trouble, he thought, but couldn't decide whether that worried or intrigued him. Alexander knew he should simply forget Victoria and return to his business, to the spreadsheets and contracts that dominated his life, but something prevented him from resuming his normal routine. He had built an empire based on his ability to read people, to predict their movements and control their reactions, but Victoria was an enigma that escaped all his usual strategies. There was an authenticity about her that disarmed him, a brutal honesty that contrasted violently with the world of masks and power games in which he lived. His fingers drummed nervously on the window glass, a habit he had abandoned years ago, and that now returned as a sign of his growing unease. He turned his back on the window and walked back to his desk, but stopped halfway, unable to shake the feeling that his life had changed forever on that rainy night. She still feels the weight of my gaze on her skin, he thought, and realized that this was exactly what he desired. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria crossed the gates of the mansion like a wet ghost, and now she moved through the library with the grace of someone who had found her place in the world, even if temporarily. The tall shelves of polished mahogany rose around her like cathedrals of knowledge, and she spent her days organizing the thousands of volumes with almost reverent care. Her fingers slid over the aging leather spines, arranging biographies of powerful men, economics treatises, and philosophy books that seemed to have been read and reread countless times. The work gave her purpose and, more importantly, allowed her to maintain the dignity she refused to abandon, even in the most humiliating circumstances. At least here I have value, she thought as she placed a copy of Machiavelli in its proper place. The routine had established itself like a silent dance between her and Alexander, an unrehearsed but perfectly synchronized choreography that they both executed without ever admitting they were participating in it. Every morning when Victoria arrived at the library, she found a still steaming cup of coffee on the small marble table where she had placed her personal belongings. The coffee was always at the perfect temperature, with exactly the amount of sugar she liked, although she had never told anyone her preferences. She drank the coffee in silence, savoring not just the hot liquid, but the certainty that someone had thought of her even before she awoke. "He knows I exist," she whispered to herself, feeling a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Alexander appeared in the library always at the same times, as if following an internal timer that brought him there without his presence seeming intentional or planned. He walked among the shelves with the natural elegance of a predator in his territory, pretending to look for specific books, but Victoria could feel his eyes on her like a physical caress that made her tremble. Her hands shook slightly when he was nearby, and she concentrated intensely on her task to not appear affected by the magnetic presence of that man. He never spoke much, just polite greetings and brief instructions about the organization, but there was an intensity in his eyes that said much more than words ever could express. Why does he come here every day? She wondered, but was afraid to discover the answer. Victoria had noticed Alexander's reading patterns, and without him asking or knowing, always left the books he sought most in easily accessible places. Works on military strategy were always at his eye level. Biographies of historical leaders were placed on the central table, and the rare volumes of poetry he occasionally browsed mysteriously appeared on shelves closest to his leather armchair. It was a silent form of care she offered, without expecting recognition, a way to reciprocate hospitality without needing to ask or thank in words. When she saw Alexander picking up one of the books she had strategically positioned, a small secret smile played on her lips. At least I can do something for him, she thought, feeling a strange satisfaction in anticipating his needs. The days succeeded one another in a routine that was simultaneously comforting and torturous, as each moment in Alexander's presence intensified an attraction that Victoria refused to acknowledge. She observed his elegant hands turning the pages of books, the way his forehead slightly furrowed when he concentrated, how he ran his fingers through his hair when deep in thought. There was a profound loneliness in that man that she recognized because it mirrored her own, a sense of isolation that power and wealth couldn't fill. Sometimes she caught him looking out the window with a distant expression, as if lost in memories that weren't entirely happy. What hurt him so deeply, she wondered, wishing she could offer the same silent comfort he gave her. Alexander, in turn, struggled daily against the growing need to be near Victoria, inventing increasingly elaborate excuses to visit the library and watch her work. There was something hypnotizing about the way she moved between the shelves, the delicacy with which she treated each book, the serene concentration that transformed her face into a work of art. He memorized every detail of her appearance, the way she tied her hair in a loose bun when focused, the small wrinkle that appeared between her eyebrows when she found a damaged book, the almost imperceptible smile that illuminated her lips when she discovered a title that interested her. He was losing control over his own feelings, and this terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. "She's destroying me without even knowing it," he admitted in his moments of brutal honesty with himself. The tension between them grew like a silent storm, charging the air with electricity that made each casual encounter seem like an event of epic proportions. When their fingers accidentally touched as they reached for the same book, the electric current that ran through their bodies was so intense that both recoiled as if burned. Victoria felt her heart dangerously accelerate whenever she heard Alexander's footsteps approaching, and he, in turn, needed long minutes to regain his composure after each of these encounters. They developed their own language made of furtive glances, silences laden with meaning, and gestures that seemed casual but were carefully calculated. "This is madness," Victoria whispered to herself, but couldn't stop participating in that dangerous dance. That specific afternoon, Victoria was reorganizing the economics section when she heard Alexander's voice echoing down the corridor, carrying a coldness she had never personally witnessed. He was speaking on the phone in a low but incisive tone, using words that made her blood freeze in her veins. Territories, loyalty, consequences for those who dared challenge his authority. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Victoria truly understood what kind of world she had taken refuge in, and the knowledge left her paralyzed between the shelves. Alexander wasn't just a rich and powerful man. He was someone whose influence extended into shadowy areas she didn't even imagine existed. "God, what have I gotten myself into?" she thought, feeling an icy fear mixed with a disturbing fascination. The telephone conversation continued, and Victoria found herself unable to move or make any noise that might reveal her involuntary presence as a witness to matters that clearly weren't for her ears. Alexander was talking about issues involving large sums of money, about people who had betrayed agreements, and about the need to send clear messages to those who thought of challenging him. His voice maintained the same elegance she knew, but now carried an absolute authority and a veiled threat that made her realize how little she really knew about the man who had offered her shelter. Each word revealed layers of a parallel world where normal rules of society did not apply, where power was exercised in ways she preferred not to imagine. "He is dangerous," she concluded, but the revelation did not bring the fear it should have. When the call finally ended, Victoria remained motionless between the bookshelves, her heart beating so loudly that she was certain Alexander could hear it from where he stood. She knew she should pretend she hadn't heard anything, return to her work as if that conversation had never happened, but something kept her paralyzed in place. There was a part of her that felt strangely excited to discover that the man who fascinated her was even more complex and mysterious than she had imagined. The danger he represented didn't repel her. On the contrary, it added a new dimension to the attraction she already felt, as if she finally understood why he exerted such a powerful magnetism over her. "I should be afraid," she thought, "but I only feel that I want to know him even more." Alexander appeared at the library entrance like an elegant shadow, and Victoria immediately knew that he had noticed her presence during the call. There was something different in his posture, a tension she hadn't seen before, as if he were deciding how to handle an unforeseen and potentially problematic situation. His eyes found her among the shelves with laser precision, and she felt like prey that had been discovered in forbidden territory. For a moment, neither of them moved, trapped in a mutual assessment that carried the weight of everything that had been revealed without words. Victoria raised her chin with the same proud dignity she had shown on the first night, refusing to show fear, even knowing she had crossed an invisible line. "You heard," he said, and it wasn't a question. Victoria felt her mouth go dry, but she didn't lower her eyes before Alexander's penetrating gaze, even knowing that her answer could change everything between them forever. The moment of truth had arrived, and she discovered that she didn't want to lie to him, even if honesty could cost her the only refuge she had. Her lips parted to form a response, but the words seemed too heavy to come out, laden with implications she wasn't prepared to face. Alexander began to walk toward her with slow, deliberate steps, and every movement of his radiated an intensity that made the air around them vibrate with electricity. There was no anger in his eyes as she had expected, but something much more dangerous and fascinating. "Yes," she finally whispered. "I heard." Alexander continued approaching until the space between them was reduced to a few inches, and Victoria could feel the heat emanating from his body, the masculine perfume that always made her dizzy, the contained strength he radiated effortlessly. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely naked and exposed, as if he could read every thought that passed through her mind. There was something primitive in that moment, a sexual tension that transcended words and manifested in the way their bodies seemed magnetized to each other. Victoria knew she should step back, preserve the safe distance they had maintained for 3 weeks, but her feet refused to obey her. "And what are you going to do with that information?" he asked, his hoarse voice carrying a promise and a threat in equal measure. Victoria turned to leave, urgently needing space to breathe and process everything she had discovered about Alexander and about herself, but her movements were interrupted when she realized he had moved even closer. She found herself literally cornered between his masculine body and the bookshelf at her back, with no possibility of physical or emotional escape. His scent enveloped her like an intoxicating cloud, mixing notes of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine that made her knees tremble. Their eyes met in a connection so intense that she felt as if the world around had disappeared, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that carried the weight of all the unexplored possibilities between them. She turned to leave and found him standing there so close she could smell his scent in the air. The navy blue velvet box appeared on the library table like a silent promise, accompanied only by an elegant card with Alexander's perfect handwriting. "For tonight." Not a request. Victoria ran her fingers over the soft surface of the box, feeling her heart racing even before discovering what was inside. When she finally lifted the lid, the dress she found was a work of art in midnight blue silk, with a cut that promised to enhance every curve of her body without being vulgar. It was exactly the type of piece she could never buy for herself, but that seemed to have been created specifically for her. The fabric slipped between her fingers like liquid water, and she wondered how Alexander had managed to perfectly match her size. "He observes me more than I imagined," she thought, feeling a strange mixture of vulnerability and excitement. Victoria hesitated for long minutes before accepting to wear the dress, struggling between her wounded pride and the burning curiosity about what kind of event Alexander planned for her to accompany him to. She knew that accepting that gift meant crossing another invisible line in her complex relationship with him, admitting that she was willing to participate in his world in a more intimate way. But when she looked in the mirror after putting on the piece, she barely recognized the elegant woman who stared back. The dress transformed her appearance in an almost magical way, making her look like a sophisticated version of herself she didn't know existed. Her loose hair fell in soft waves over her bare shoulders, and her eyes seemed deeper and more mysterious, reflected in the dark fabric. "Perhaps for one night I can pretend I belong in this world," she murmured to her reflection. The mansion's terrace had been transformed into a dreamlike setting, with golden lights hanging between marble columns and tables elegantly arranged with white flower arrangements that perfumed the night air. The guests circulated in small groups, men in impeccable suits, and women dressed like precious jewels, all emanating the kind of power and sophistication that Victoria recognized but had never experienced up close. She felt like an actress playing a role she hadn't rehearsed for, trying to imitate the naturalness with which others moved in that environment. Alexander appeared beside her without making a sound, elegant in his black tuxedo, and offered her his arm with a formal courtesy that contrasted with the growing intimacy they had developed. "You look stunning," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration that made her heart skip a beat. During the first hour of the party, Victoria stayed close to Alexander, observing how he easily navigated among his guests, alternating between magnetic charm and subtle authority according to the needs of each conversation. She could see how people gravitated toward him, seeking his approval or trying to impress him, and began to truly understand the extent of his power and influence. There was a complex social dance happening around her, full of subtexts and hidden meanings that she was just beginning to decipher. Alexander introduced her as "my guest," with a discreet propriety that did not go unnoticed by anyone, and Victoria felt the curious and speculative gazes of others upon her. "They're trying to figure out who I am to him," she realized, "and I would like to know the answer too." It was when Alexander stepped away for a private conversation with a group of older men that Trevor appeared like a refreshing breeze amid the charged atmosphere of the party. He was young, perhaps a few years younger than Victoria, with an easy smile and eyes that shone with a genuine joy that contrasted with Alexander's controlled intensity. His suit was well cut but not ostentatious, and there was a naturalness in his movements that made her relax for the first time in weeks. When he introduced himself as a lawyer specializing in international law and began to tell funny stories about his most unusual cases, Victoria found herself laughing spontaneously, a sound she had forgotten she was capable of producing. "How long has it been since I laughed like this?" she thought, feeling as if a forgotten part of herself was reawakening. Trevor had the gift of making Victoria feel interesting and desirable, without seeming predatory or calculating, something she hadn't experienced since before her life completely fell apart. He asked questions about her interests, listened to her answers with genuine attention, and had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen for who she really was, not for what she had lost or what she needed. When he suggested they walk to the quieter part of the terrace to escape the crowd, Victoria accepted without hesitation, grateful for the opportunity to converse without having to maintain the mask of sophistication that the party required. They leaned against the marble balustrade that overlooked the illuminated gardens, and for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt genuinely relaxed and happy. "It's good to remember what it's like to be just myself," she said, surprising herself with her own honesty. From across the terrace, Alexander observed the interaction between Victoria and Trevor, with a growing tension that he could no longer disguise or ignore. His hands closed into involuntary fists when he saw Trevor lean closer to Victoria, and his jaw clenched when she laughed at something the young lawyer whispered in her ear. There was a lightness in Victoria that Alexander had never witnessed, a natural joy that Trevor had managed to awaken in just a few minutes, and that he himself had never been able to evoke. The realization hurt more than any physical injury he had ever suffered, because it revealed something he refused to admit. He wanted to be the person capable of making Victoria smile that way. "He's touching her too much," he growled to himself, feeling a primitive wave of possessiveness that surprised him with its intensity. The conversation Alexander maintained with his associates became a torture disguised as professional courtesy, as he couldn't concentrate on business matters while watching Victoria being courted just a few meters away. Each smile she directed at Trevor was like a stab to his pride. Each graceful gesture a reminder that she didn't belong to him, that she had chosen to maintain emotional distance from him. Trevor was clearly enchanted with Victoria, and Alexander could see the growing admiration in the young lawyer's eyes, the way he leaned in closer, how his hands gesticulated animatedly to keep her attention. The soft music and golden lights created a romantic atmosphere that Alexander had planned for his guests, but which now turned against him cruelly. "This cannot continue," he decided, abruptly interrupting the conversation about imports to approach the couple. When Trevor leaned in to kiss Victoria, taking advantage of a contemplative moment of silence in which both were observing the stars that began to appear in the darkening sky. Alexander felt something fierce and primitive explode in his chest. He crossed the terrace with controlled but determined steps, each movement loaded with an authority that made the other guests instinctively make way. Trevor was whispering something in Victoria's ear, his hands delicately touching her bare arms, when Alexander appeared beside them with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. The interruption was smooth but definitive, masked by the social courtesy that Alexander perfectly mastered, but Victoria could feel the dangerous tension radiating from him like heat waves. "Trevor, I hope you're enjoying the party," Alexander said in a silky voice, "but I need to show Victoria the gardens. They're truly spectacular in the starlight." Trevor, oblivious to the undercurrents of possessiveness and jealousy that dominated the atmosphere, smiled amiably and walked away with a promise to continue their conversation later, leaving Victoria alone with Alexander in the most isolated part of the terrace. The silence that settled between them was charged with an electric tension that made the air vibrate, and Victoria could feel the change in Alexander's energy, the way his presence seemed to fill all the space around them. He moved slowly until he stood in front of her, his hands resting on the low wall on either side of her body, effectively trapping her between his arms without actually touching her. His dark eyes shone with an intensity she had never seen before, a mixture of desire, frustration, and something deeper that made her lose her breath. "Were you having fun?" he asked, his low voice carrying a note of danger that made her heart race. Victoria raised her chin with the same proud stubbornness she had shown since the first day, refusing to be intimidated by Alexander's overwhelming proximity or the obvious intensity of his jealousy. There was something liberating about finally seeing a crack in the mask of perfect control he always maintained, proof that she affected his emotions as much as he affected hers. Her eyes sparkled with defiance when they met his, and she could smell the masculine perfume that always made her dizzy, enveloping her like an intoxicating cloud. The proximity of their bodies created a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the night, and Victoria found that she didn't want to move away, even knowing she was playing with fire. "Trevor is an interesting man," she said deliberately, savoring the way Alexander's eyes narrowed. "At least he can make me laugh." Victoria's words struck Alexander like a slap, revealing a painful truth that he had tried to ignore. In all the weeks she had spent in his home, he had never been able to awaken in her the spontaneous joy that Trevor managed to provoke in a single conversation. The realization was devastating for a man accustomed to conquering everything he desired, and he leaned even closer, his lips almost touching her ear when he whispered his response. Their bodies were now separated by only a few inches, and Victoria could feel the heat emanating from him, the tension that vibrated in every muscle of his controlled body. His scent completely enveloped her, a mixture of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine that made her knees dangerously tremble. "Perhaps you don't know all my talents," he murmured, his husky voice carrying a promise that made her blood boil in her veins. The distance between them disappeared like snow in the sun when Alexander finally gave in to the desire he had fought to control for weeks, his hands moving to frame Victoria's face with a delicacy that contrasted with the hungry intensity of his eyes. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, they looked into each other's eyes, and Victoria could see the silent question he was asking, the last opportunity he offered for her to retreat before they crossed a line that would change everything between them forever. But instead of pulling away, she leaned slightly toward him, her lips parting in an unconscious invitation that was the only permission Alexander needed. When their mouths finally met, the kiss exploded between them with a passion that stole the breath from both, years of repressed tension releasing in a moment of absolute connection. "God, how I wanted this," Victoria thought, losing herself completely in the sensation of finally being in his arms. The kiss between them was not gentle or hesitant, but an explosion of desire and need that had been suppressed for too long, carrying all the sexual tension that had accumulated during weeks of forced proximity and denied attraction. Alexander kissed Victoria as if she were essential to his survival, his hands tangling in her silky hair as he pulled her even closer, eliminating any space that might still exist between their bodies. Victoria responded with equal intensity, her own hands grasping the lapels of his tuxedo, pulling him closer as she completely surrendered to that moment of total abandonment. The world around them disappeared. The party, the guests, the complications of their lives, everything dissolved until there were only the two of them suspended in a universe made of passion and mutual desire. When they finally separated, both were breathless, lost in each other's eyes as if seeing for the first time. He pulled away first, leaving her breathless, but the taste of him still burned on her lips. Morning arrived with a coldness that penetrated to Victoria's bones, and when she went down to the library, expecting to find the usual hot coffee, she encountered only the icy silence that hung over the mansion like a dense fog. Alexander had been in his office since dawn, but this time there was not even a glance when she passed through the hallway, no sign of the ardent intimacy that had exploded between them the night before. There was something different in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with repressed desire, but with a calculated distance that made Victoria's stomach twist with apprehension. She unconsciously touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of the kiss that had changed everything, but now wondered if she had imagined all the passion she thought she had shared with him. Perhaps for him it was just a moment of weakness, she thought, tasting the first bitter flavor of doubt. Throughout the morning, Victoria tried to concentrate on her work in the library, organizing the books with an almost obsessive precision to try to distract her mind from the turbulent thoughts that consumed her. Every sound coming from Alexander's office made her raise her head with expectation, hoping he would appear with some explanation for his sudden coldness. But the hours dragged on without any sign of his presence. The silence was deafening, loaded with all the unspoken words that seemed to press against the walls of the mansion like a storm about to break. She felt like a fool for having believed that kiss meant something beyond a momentary impulse, for having interpreted his passion as something deeper than physical desire. "I should have known that men like him don't really get involved," she murmured to herself, fighting against the tears that threatened to overflow. It was while reorganizing the files from the side table that Victoria found the brown leather folder that would change everything forever, hidden among financial reports and business correspondence like a bomb waiting to explode. Her hands trembled when she recognized her family's name on the documents, along with dates that corresponded exactly to the period when their lives began to crumble in a seemingly inexplicable way. Each page revealed a new layer of the meticulous orchestration that had destroyed her father's business. Each document showing how Alexander had used his influence to cut off suppliers, block credits, and spread rumors that ruined the family company's reputation. The words danced before her eyes as she struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The calculated coldness with which he had destroyed innocent people for something they didn't even understand. "Everything was planned from the beginning," she whispered, feeling the world crumble around her for the second time. The final document in the folder revealed the motivation behind Alexander's meticulous revenge, an unpaid debt her father had incurred years ago during the early days of his business, when he had accepted money from sources he couldn't fully identify. Victoria read the astronomical figures, the compound interest that had transformed a desperate loan into an impossible amount to pay off, and began to understand the extent of the dark world in which she had taken refuge. Her father had messed with dangerous people without understanding the consequences, and Alexander had spent years planning retribution that destroyed not just the debtor, but his entire family. Tears finally overflowed when she realized that even her desperate arrival at the mansion gates hadn't been a coincidence, but the final act of a cruel play where she was merely a pawn. "He knew exactly who I was when he let me in," she concluded, feeling completely humiliated and used. Victoria climbed the stairs toward Alexander's office, with the documents pressed against her chest, each step echoing through the mansion like a death sentence for any illusion she might still have about his feelings for her. She knocked on the door harder than necessary, and when he invited her in with that neutral voice she now knew to be a carefully constructed mask, she entered the office like a hurricane of contained pain and anger. Alexander was sitting behind his mahogany desk, elegant and impassive as always, but Victoria could see something different in his eyes when he noticed the documents in her hands. There was no surprise, no denial, just a tired resignation that confirmed her worst suspicions about the calculated nature of all his hospitality. "You knew who I was from the first day," she declared, throwing the folder on the desk with a force that made the papers scatter. Everything was a lie. Alexander observed the documents scattered across his desk without making any move to deny or explain them, his expression remaining as impenetrable as a marble statue. There was something in his eyes that Victoria couldn't decipher, a mixture of guilt and determination that confused her even more amid the storm of emotions that dominated her. He leaned back in his chair with the same controlled elegance as always, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers contracted almost imperceptibly on the arms of the chair. For long minutes, silence stretched between them like an insurmountable abyss, loaded with all the truths that had been hidden and all the lies that had been lived. When he finally spoke, his voice was empty of any emotion, as if he were reading an ordinary business report. "Yes, I knew who you were," he admitted bluntly. "And now you know who I am too." Alexander's cold confession hit Victoria like a punch to the stomach, eliminating any remaining hope that there might be an innocent explanation for the whole situation. She supported herself on the edge of the desk, feeling her legs weaken at the confirmation that everything she had experienced in the past few weeks had been based on an elaborate lie. Her hands trembled as she pointed to the documents that detailed the systematic destruction of her family, her voice coming out choked by the pain that threatened to completely suffocate her. The man she had kissed with such passion the night before was the same one who had coldly orchestrated the ruin of everything she loved, and the contradiction was so brutal that she could barely process reality. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking on the simple word. "My father was already dead when you finished with our company. Why did you bring me here? To amuse yourself with my humiliation?" Alexander rose slowly from his chair, but made no movement toward Victoria, maintaining the physical distance that now seemed to mirror the emotional chasm that had opened between them. There was something in his posture that suggested a fierce internal battle, as if he were fighting against contradictory impulses that split him in half. His eyes met hers for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, and Victoria could see layers of complex emotions that he refused to express in words. When he finally answered, his voice carried a coldness that contrasted violently with the passion he had shown the night before, as if two different people inhabited the same body. "Your feelings were never part of the original plan," he said, each word chosen with surgical precision. "But things have changed, and now you are free to leave if you wish." The offer of freedom sounded more like a dismissal, and Victoria felt as if Alexander was pushing her away with the same calculated determination he had used to destroy her family. There were no apologies, no attempt to explain or justify his actions, just a cold acceptance that she had discovered the truth and now must deal with the consequences. She studied his face, looking for some sign of the passionate man who had kissed her under the stars, but found only the impassive mask of the businessman who had learned to hide his feelings behind a facade of absolute control. The pain she felt was physical, as if someone was tearing pieces of her heart out with bare hands, but there was also a growing anger that helped her maintain dignity in the face of total humiliation. "So it was all a lie," she stated. "It was not a question. Even yesterday's kiss." Alexander did not respond to Victoria's accusation, but something flickered in his eyes for a fraction of a second before being quickly suppressed, as if she had touched a wound he preferred to keep hidden. He walked to the window with controlled movements, turning his back to her in a way that seemed both an escape and a dismissal, and Victoria felt the clear message that the conversation was over. Her hands closed into fists at her sides as she fought against the urge to scream, to demand explanations, to force him to admit that he had felt something real for her, even if briefly. But her wounded dignity spoke louder, and she rose with all the grace she could muster, refusing to beg for crumbs of affection from a man who had demonstrated himself capable of a calculated cruelty she had never imagined possible. "Very well," she said, her voice gaining a firmness that surprised even herself. "I will be out of this house by the end of the day." The room that had been her refuge for weeks now seemed like a golden prison, as Victoria packed her bags with mechanical movements. Each personal object, she stored a painful reminder of the naivety that had led her to believe she could find something real in that world of lies. The midnight blue dress Alexander had chosen for her hung in the closet like a symbol of all the illusions she had nurtured, and she left it there, refusing to take anything that might remind her of the night when she had been foolish enough to believe that he truly cared for her. Her hands trembled as she folded the few clothes that really belonged to her, and she forced herself not to look out the window, where she knew she could see the garden where she had walked with him, where she had begun to believe that perhaps she could have a different future. "At least now I know the truth," she murmured to herself, though the truth hurt more than all the lies she had believed. Victoria's departure from the mansion was as quiet as her arrival had been dramatic, with no confrontations or final declarations, just a woman carrying a small suitcase walking toward the gates that opened automatically to let her pass. She did not look back, did not allow her resolve to weaken before the majesty of the property that had been her temporary home, but she could feel eyes watching her departure even without turning to confirm. The world outside seemed smaller and grayer after the opulence she had grown accustomed to living in, but there was a brutal honesty in the reality she would face now that contrasted with the deceptive beauty she was leaving behind. Each step she took carried her further from Alexander and closer to a life that would be difficult but genuine, built on painful truths instead of seductive lies. "Now I can start over for real," she thought, trying to convince herself that the freedom she gained was worth the pain she felt. The small apartment that Victoria managed to rent in the city was a universe away from Alexander's mansion, with thin walls that let in the noise from neighbors and a tiny kitchen that could barely hold one person. But there was something comforting in the modesty of the place, an honesty that calmed her after weeks of living amid the luxury she now knew had been purchased with her family's suffering. The job she found at a small downtown bookstore didn't pay much, but it gave her purpose and the dignity of earning her own living without depending on anyone's self-interested charity. Her days became a simple routine of work, reading, and desperate attempts not to think about the man she had left behind, although her efforts were rarely successful. "At least now I own my own life," she repeated to herself every night, like a mantra against the longing that insisted on visiting her. The weeks dragged on with cruel slowness, each day a struggle against memories that insisted on returning at the most unexpected moments. The smell of coffee Alexander left for her every morning, the intensity of his eyes when he watched her working in the library, the devastating passion of his kiss under the stars. Victoria tried to build a new routine that didn't include thoughts of him, but discovered that Alexander had infiltrated every aspect of her consciousness in a way that made it impossible to simply forget him. Her small, simple bed seemed too large on nights when she caught herself imagining what it would be like to have those strong arms around her, and she woke every morning with a feeling of emptiness that no amount of coffee could fill. There was a part of her that hated him for the cruel manipulation, but an even larger part that simply missed him in a way that frightened her. "How can I miss someone who lied to me about everything?" she asked herself, but never found a satisfactory answer. The emptiness Victoria felt wasn't just emotional, but physical, as if an essential part of herself had been torn away and left behind in the mansion she now avoided even thinking about. She tried to convince herself it was better this way, that discovering the truth about Alexander had been a blessing in disguise that saved her from an even deeper involvement with a man capable of such calculated cruelty. But late at night, when the city slept and she was alone with her thoughts, the rationalization dissolved before the visceral memory of what she had felt in his arms, of the electric connection that had existed between them regardless of the lies that surrounded it. There were moments when she wondered if at least part of what she had seen in his eyes was genuine, if perhaps he too was suffering from the separation, but quickly dismissed these thoughts as dangerous fantasies. "He probably doesn't even remember I exist," she concluded, trying to harden her heart against hopes that would only bring more pain. Victoria closed the door of her small apartment after another day of work, leaning against the cheap wood with a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. The silence of the apartment wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, reminding her once again of how small and lonely her life had become after leaving the mansion. She went to the window overlooking the busy street, watching people hurrying by in their lives, all with purposes and destinations that seemed clearer than her own. There was a melancholy in the way the evening light painted the facades of the old buildings, a melancholic beauty that mirrored her own emotional state almost cruelly. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if Alexander appeared on the street, if he had come looking for her with explanations or apologies, but quickly dismissed the thought as a childish fantasy. She closed the apartment door, not knowing that he was standing across the street watching. The week had begun cruelly when Victoria discovered that her former family was spreading lies about her at the bookstore where she worked, whispering to other neighborhood merchants that she was unstable and unreliable. The bookstore owner called her in for an awkward conversation, explaining that he had received calls questioning her integrity and that perhaps it would be better for her to look for another job. Victoria felt the world crumbling beneath her feet again, realizing that even far from Alexander's mansion, she was still being punished for the sins of a family that had rejected her. They'll never leave me in peace, she thought, fighting against the despair that threatened to consume her. That night, when Victoria climbed the narrow stairs leading to her apartment, she found a small bouquet of white gardenias leaning against her door, without a card or identification. Her hands trembled as she picked up the delicate bouquet, and the soft perfume of the flowers instantly transported her back to the afternoons she spent watching Alexander walk among the flower beds of the mansion. Gardenias were his favorite, she had noticed, always carefully cultivated and arranged in crystal vases in the office and library. He was here, she murmured to herself, looking around the empty hallway as if she might find some trace of his presence. The job offer arrived the next day in an elegant envelope delivered by a private messenger, containing an offer from a prestigious company that Victoria would never dare imagine was within her reach. The salary offered was 3 times more than anything she had ever earned, and the position was exactly in her field of training, as if someone had carefully studied her resume and created the perfect opportunity specifically for her. She read and reread the letter several times, looking for some catch or hidden condition, but everything seemed too genuine and generous to be a coincidence. "Alexander," she whispered, feeling a confusing mixture of gratitude and irritation that he was still interfering in her life. Victoria spent the entire day divided between the excitement of the professional opportunity and the frustration of knowing that her independence was once again being manipulated by Alexander's invisible hands. She desperately wanted the job, not just for the money, but for the chance to finally use her skills in something meaningful, but at the same time resented the way he continued to control her destiny even from a distance. There was something disturbing about knowing that he still thought about her, that somehow he was watching her life and intervening when he thought necessary. "Why can't he just leave me alone?" she thought, but a small and stubborn part of her heart whispered that perhaps she didn't want him to leave her completely. When Victoria arrived home that night, carrying the job offer letter and the gardenias she had taken to work, she found her apartment door unlocked and a familiar figure sitting in her simple armchair. Alexander was there, elegant as always in his dark suit, but there was something different in his posture, a vulnerability she had never seen before, as if all the masks he wore had finally fallen. His eyes met hers the moment she entered, and Victoria felt her heart stop and then race at a dangerous speed. "How did you get in here?" she asked, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. Alexander rose slowly from the armchair, moving with the controlled grace she knew so well, but there was something hesitant in his gestures, as if he wasn't sure of his reception or his right to be there. He didn't answer her question immediately, instead allowing his eyes to scan every detail of the small apartment, taking in the simple life she had built away from him. Victoria could see something that looked like regret passing across his features when he noticed the modesty of the place. "I needed to talk to you," he finally said, his voice carrying a humility she had never heard before. "And I feared that if I asked for a meeting, you would refuse." Victoria remained standing near the door, still holding the flowers and the job offer letter, as if these objects could somehow protect her from the intensity of Alexander's presence in her personal space. There was something surreal about seeing him in that simple environment, his natural elegance contrasting violently with the cheap furniture and peeling walls, but at the same time, he seemed completely focused on her. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, and she vividly remembered all the nights she had dreamed of this moment. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to show. Alexander took a step toward Victoria, then stopped, as if remembering that he no longer had the right to invade her personal space without permission, and the hesitant gesture revealed more about his feelings than any statement could make. There was an evident battle happening in his eyes, between the powerful man accustomed to taking what he wanted and the man in love who had discovered that some things couldn't be conquered through force or manipulation. His hands opened and closed at his sides, as if he were fighting against the impulse to reach for her. "I know I have no right to be here," he admitted, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. "But I needed you to know the truth about everything." Victoria felt her heart race when Alexander began to speak, his voice losing the controlled coldness he had maintained during their last conversation and gaining a raw honesty that made her realize that this time he wasn't hiding anything behind masks or power games. He told her about the revenge he had meticulously planned against her father, about years of accumulated anger that had shaped every decision he made, but also about how everything had changed the moment she crossed the gates of his mansion. There was a vulnerability in his confession that Victoria never imagined he would be capable of showing. "I planned the revenge, yes," he said, looking into her eyes without looking away. "But I never planned to fall in love with you." The confession of love hit Victoria like lightning, leaving her speechless and making her legs dangerously tremble, because she had dreamed of these words during all the lonely nights since she left the mansion. Alexander continued talking, explaining how he had fought against his feelings, how he had tried to maintain emotional distance from her but found it impossible, how the kiss they shared had destroyed any pretense that he was in control of the situation. He spoke about the weeks following her departure, about how he had been unable to concentrate on anything beyond the memory of her perfume. "I thought that letting you go would protect you from me," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But I discovered that I can't live without you." Alexander stopped talking and looked at Victoria with an expression that mixed hope and terror, as if he were offering his heart for her to trample if she so wished, and she could see that this was the first time in his life that he had placed himself in a position of total vulnerability. He explained about the job offer, about how he had used his influence to open doors that her family had tried to close, but also made it clear that she was free to accept the position and never see him again. There was a painful beauty in seeing him so completely disarmed, this powerful man reduced to a supplicant, waiting for mercy. "You can keep the job, and I will disappear from your life forever," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or you can come home with me." The word home echoed in the small apartment like a promise and a question, loaded with all the possibilities that Victoria had tried to bury in her heart. Alexander wasn't just offering a return to the luxurious mansion, but a shared life, a future built on the love that had blossomed between them, despite all the lies. Victoria could see in his eyes that he perfectly understood what he was asking, that he knew she would have every right to reject him. "The choice is yours, Victoria," he said, using her name like a caress. "And whatever your decision, I will respect it." Victoria remained silent for long minutes, studying the face of the man who had turned her world upside down twice, looking for signs of lies but finding only brutal honesty. There was a part of her that wanted to punish him, but a larger part recognized the vulnerable man before her as the same one who had left hot coffee for her every morning, who had kissed her with transcendent passion. She could feel tears threatening to overflow when she realized she had never stopped loving him. "You hurt me deeply," she finally said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. Victoria felt something melt in her chest before Alexander's genuine humility and slowly began to walk toward him, each step a conscious decision to choose love over pride, forgiveness over revenge. When she finally stopped in front of him, she could see unshed tears shining in his dark eyes and realized that this powerful man was completely at her mercy. She slowly raised her hand and touched his face with a gentleness that contrasted with all the pain she had carried, feeling how he involuntarily leaned toward her touch. She held his hand against her own face, like someone who had finally found their place in the world. Did you like Victoria and Alexander's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.